From a certain point in his life, he was going to live only for himself, school, studies, classmates, and so on. All this became not for him. At least he decided so then. All these thoughts were interrupted at one moment by his interlocutor, who turned to young Mr. Li Han and asked him to look straight, because it seemed to him that they had finally arrived at the place. According to the man, they arrived at the best school of magic in the entire empire, which was called Einregard, and the man's name was Arlog, and it seemed to him that he, as an old knight, was not quite suitable to help the guy. But still, he was very glad that he had the opportunity to see how he grew up, became a wonderful young man, and entered the ranks of Einregard's students. At that moment, the guy had only disappointment in his head, that he ultimately could not break his connection with the school, even in this life. His very good friend congratulated him on his graduation. It seemed to him that this day would never come. But finally they were able to get out of slavery. He couldn't even believe for a moment that they could survive with such professors. Li Kan completely agreed with him, because one could only remember the incident when he and the professor walked several kilometers, and he told him to join the walking club, or when he was assigned to write an essay of several hundred pages and do it all in one night, but he simply could not refuse and again had to stay awake. But now they can finally forget about this place forever. Although according to his friend, some of the guys decided to stay to work at the university as graduate students. After which his friend jokingly told him that it seemed to him that he fit perfectly into this life. So he invited him to go study further. Li Kan believed that all this was already going too far. He believed that he had already done too much for this place, so he was not going to study anywhere else. Li Kan decided that he would do everything in this life to simply live for himself and not think about anything else. So he no longer needed to be in a place like graduate school. A man driving a huge truck tried to do everything to slow down, but apparently his brakes simply failed. And this was bad news not only for him, but also for Li Kan, who at that moment decided to cross the road. At that moment, his studies and diploma ultimately turned out to be a useless piece of paper, but his intention remained unshakable even after rebirth. After this terrible accident, Li Kan woke up in a new body, but the most important thing was that he remembered every moment of his past life. But in the next life he became not just a man, but the third son of the strongest magical house in the empire, and he simply could not believe that all this was really true. He was reborn in another world, and also an aristocrat. It really was something out of fantasy. It was impossible to say that he actually liked all this very much, because he became the third son of a rich and powerful family. And it really couldn't have been better. Li Han believed that he was rewarded for attending the university in a previous life, and for studying so hard. And it seemed to him that this was his chance to relax. But a little later it turned out that he was incredibly mistaken. After all, it is worth taking into account only the first rule of the Vardana's house, that the first son inherits everything, but the rest of the sons are obliged to determine their own path. Fortunately, the family supports all educational endeavors, so young Li Kan asked the old knight to teach him fencing, because he believed it would be useful to him in the future, and besides, there was no better lesson. Arlog even suggested that he take advantage of this and take the path of the sword, but Lina considered this not the best idea, because he believed that he was destined to become a magician, and besides, it seemed to him that this path was more stable than the path of the sword. But then he realized that it would be better if he did not say this, because Arlog is still a knight, and it could sound too offensive and ambitious. Although the man's reaction was incredibly unexpected, because he suddenly bowed his head in front of him and began to say that he was surprised by his intelligence at such a young age. And this was not surprising, because according to him, most noble children have illusions. That is, he wanted to say that they are too ambitious at a young age, but he immediately realized that Li Han is not like that, because he takes a reasonable approach to planning the future. Li Kan realized that at least in this case his university helped him, after completing which he began to soberly assess reality. And with such a sense of understanding, he knew that everyone from the knightly order to the adventurers guild and even to the imperial family was always happy to have capable magicians. And he and his family have a great opportunity to get into an institution where talented magicians are trained. And we are talking about the greatest academy of magic in the Einregard Empire, in which the guy needed to hold out for a couple more years. And it was so simple for him, because he would have to study again. But he promised himself that he would try to do it. Arlog was confident that he would do a good job, because even the patriarch praised the talent of young Li Kan. But Li Han was not going to believe all this, because he said this after he was not allowed to practice magic, since it was dangerous for children. But in any case, he was grateful to the knight for his kind words. The man still believed that this was the pure truth, but on this he wished him only good luck, because the horses and accompanying people could not go any further. And Li Kan went to this school of magicians without much regret. But as soon as he entered the territory of this academy, the first thing he was surprised by was that there were so many people there, And after a few minutes it became clear to him that Einregard is a place that you can actually enter more than one. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by some guy who was standing next to him, and he was literally shaking. So Lacan couldn't help but ask if he was okay. The fact was that the guy could not stay even for several hours without his servants. According to him, he could not even sleep. This strange guy literally proved to Lacan that they were like air to him and he couldn't live without them. Lacan didn't know what to answer him because it was so strange to him, and in general, all these nobles were strange people. But what angered him even more was that, for the sake of equality, they accepted slaves for training, and he was going to take advantage of his family's position to complain about this, and Lihan was very interested to know how he would do this. The magician the guy approached used only one spell, which stopped the guy in place, after which he generally began to say that he repented, and completely agreed that he was wrong. For Lihan, it was surprising that they did not hesitate to use such a spell on the nobles, and apparently the rumors about this academy were true. Rumors said that it was full of monsters, and that if you died in this academy, your body would be buried in the mountains behind the academy. How all the attention was drawn to the huge gates, which at one moment opened and someone welcomed all the new students to Einrogard. Likan immediately felt an incredibly strong magical pressure, and apparently it came from the rumored director. Looking at the other students, he understood why they suddenly froze with tension. After which suddenly the director once again reminded each of them that they had to enter this place alone, but apparently no one listened to him. After which he decided that since they did not want to obey the rules, he would force them to do so. And therefore, with the help of magic, he literally began to drag into the academy all the horses and all the things that other students had brought with them. Some of them shouted that if he sent his servants away, then there would be no one to serve them. Others shouted that they were so sorry for the clothes they took to this academy. After this act, he asked them a question in which he wanted to know why they were crowded together like a herd of sheep, and asked them to enter as soon as possible. This is how Likan's first day at Einrogard, the greatest academy of magic in the Empire, began. And he didn't have a very good feeling about this, but he couldn't do anything about it. Likan followed everyone and was completely in his thoughts until he was distracted by someone's voice calling his name. So he had to turn around to see who spoke to him. And it was a small girl who introduced herself as Ina Macon, and she was from the Macon house, which, like the Lekhanov house, was the house of magicians. Lihan politely answered her that he was glad to meet you and would like to know what she wanted, to which she replied that His Imperial Highness would like to see him. The guy didn't quite understand what the prince needed from him, but apparently he'd have to come over. Although one thing Likan still understood was that they were already resolutely trying to establish connections on the very first day. He thought it was too much to call this guy Imperial Highness, because the Emperor himself actually has more than 100 children. And even in the Imperial family, everyone is only interested in the firstborn, and the Emperor himself does not support his children in any way, so they have it even worse. But what was most interesting for Lihan was that in crowded places full of children of great houses like here, the Imperial family stands even lower than other houses. Even below Yenna Macon's house, Lihan didn't understand why she behaved like this. Lihan meant that he doesn't understand why she is helping some unknown prince, but in any case, it was worth considering that this was much better than making enemies. So he shook hands, and said that there was nothing wrong with making new acquaintances. The girl was incredibly glad that he thought so, because as it turned out, he was the first to react this way. And apparently, it was because this prince's name is Gainando, and he insists that he is the 97th prince of the Empire, although they say that he may be the 101st. But the guy himself insists that he is the 97th, and it was obvious that he simply does not want to leave the first 100 children. Likan thought about it so much that he completely listened to what Gainando was telling him. And he said something about how several guys had already rejected him, and one of them was standing there, and he himself simply didn't understand how they dared, because he was the prince of the imperial family. Likan told him that they must simply not know that he was of porphyry blood. But Gainando once again proved that he was immature, because he did not even know what this complex word meant. Therefore, Leon had to explain that this word meant an important person from the upper or prestigious class, and now Gainando had a smile on his face again, because he believed that it suited him well. Then he pointed his finger at the guys who refused his offer, and now they are talking with Adanarta, and for him it was humiliating. And all this was because Adanarta was the 44th princess of the empire. She was his sister. But the relationship between them was not the best. Lihan, looking at her, thought that she has the elegance characteristic of the imperial family. So of course people are drawn to her, unlike some others. Gainando interrupted his thoughts and asked the guy to deal with her. But Likan immediately tried to explain to him that noble people do not bully other people, so he will not do this. But he assured Likan that he was not asking him to mock her, but simply to teach her a lesson once. But the guy believed that this is not what noble people do. Then Ganando didn't understand what to do and what to do next, although Likan didn't understand what was so difficult about it, because it was enough to just pass by. And if he so badly wants to get even with them, then Likan invited him to challenge them to a duel. The guy decided that he shouldn't go that far, and since he is a noble prince, this time he will show mercy towards them, and therefore decided to forgive them. Yenna called Lihan amazing, because for her it was incredibly surprising that he was able to curb the stubbornness of this prince, because even she, as his relative, could not do it. In response, Likan decided to find out why she is trying to take care of him, even considering the fact that they are relatives. But before she could answer, the skull and that overwhelming aura appeared in the room again. The director again turned to the iron-headed students, who at that moment were enjoying the conversation. Other students immediately noticed that they had already seen this lich today at the gates of the academy. Likan knew very well that this was not just a lich. This creature was the result of the efforts of a great magician who wanted to become undead and bypass death. But even he really couldn't think that the director of the academy would be a lich. The director suddenly wanted to ask them a question in which he wanted to know why, in their opinion, he calls them ironheads. Adanarta was the first to raise her hand and said that the answer to this question is quite simple. All because the symbol of this year's newcomers is iron. In response, the director praised her and added 10 points to her department, which was quite surprising for her. But after a few seconds, the director upset her, saying that it was actually just a joke, and if she wants to become a magician, then first she needs to learn to distinguish truth from lies. Although she is still right that iron is really the symbol of this year's newcomers, because it is a material that changes depending on what is made of it, and in fact it is very valuable and can be used for many purposes. That's why it's so suitable for beginners, and it was also convincing that Ganando looked at the lich with his mouth open, who after a few seconds started laughing again and telling them that they were fooled again, because the reason their symbol is iron is because there is nothing in their heads. Likan liked only one thing in this situation. Although he mocked them, no one dared to answer him, because in fact it is extremely difficult to even move in this thick magical energy. Fortunately, the guy was already used to this, because in his past life he often encountered, although not with magical energy, but professors who behaved even worse, so it was much easier for him than for other guys. At some point, the director noticed that apparently he was putting too much pressure on them, and they were only after a long journey. And while he was talking about this, he noticed how Likan was able to move in this thick energy, which was incredibly surprising for him, because none of the newcomers had managed this before. In any case, now he asked each of them to pay attention to the door on the left, behind which was hidden a huge dining room, on the tables of which there was a lot of food. The director asked them not to be shy and enjoy the feast and thus get rid of fatigue. This obviously caused joy in most because many were already hungry. They sat down at the table and only hoped that now this was not another joke from the director, and this was all real food. After all, in fact, there was a lot of things there. White bread with a thick piece of cheese and butter. A plump chicken coated in oils, butter, spices, and flour, then simmered in wine to create a delicious flavor. And many other things that the students could enjoy with pleasure. And Gainando was the first to sit down at the table and decide to taste it all. But as soon as they brought the cutlery to the food, all these tasty-looking dishes literally melted into the air, and there was nothing left of them. This, as it turned out, was another joke from the director, and they were just fools who were once again fooled. Likan at that moment was thinking about what he had heard, that when you become a lich, you lose some things. And for some reason he was sure that the director had lost a lot of things. The director continued to say that this academy is the cradle of magicians, and the strongest impulse in the development of magicians is hunger. After which clothes and various kinds of scraps literally fell on them, and according to the director, this is their food and uniform. Gainan thought that this was too much. With these words he literally called the director to him, who, as it turned out, was just waiting for these words. After which he made it clear to them that if the food seemed disgusting to them, then they should do everything to study magic and create delicious food themselves, with the same form. He immediately told them that if they want something or don't like something, then it can be corrected only through magic. These are the rules of this academy. One of the students suddenly noticed the fact that they could actually ask for all this from the outside, but as it turned out, the director was ready to hear these words. And he began to talk about how newcomers were forbidden to go outside. They are also prohibited from contacting senior students whom they may see at the academy. At this point his teachings ended, and before disappearing, he wished them good luck, and said that he would hope that they would become great magicians. Lycan could not understand whether it was really a rule of life written down somewhere that all educational institutions must have an insane professor. And the guy, unfortunately, knew this type of people. Before the rebirth, the professor in the neighboring laboratory had the same sparkle in his eyes, and they were full of madness. Gainanda simply did not understand how they dare treat them like this. Although Leiharn believed that this lich was much better than the professor he had in his previous life. The prince didn't care about this lich, He was now more interested in the question of how they could live with such disgusting food and clothes. Lee Khan at this time was thinking that in fact this place was much better than what he had before his rebirth, because here they gave out not only food, but also clothes, and he considered this place to be definitely better. Noble society knows little about the House of Vardhanaz, all because they are completely absorbed in the study of magic and never participate in public activities. Because of this, misunderstandings are accumulating about them. Even now, Ganandu did not understand at all what was happening to him, and why Li Han was standing so strangely and pretending to be lost in thought. In any case, he tapped him on the shoulder and said that when he had the opportunity, he could come and visit him. Einregard accepts students regardless of their title, provided they have talent, however. In order to prevent conflicts between sensitive teenagers, the dormitory is divided into 4 towers, according to the status of the residents. The first tower was called the Overdimensional Blue Dragon Tower, and only people of high origin could enter here. Famous nobles, such as the Emperor's children and Li Han, will live here. Next was the Tower of a Phoenix, burning from the inside. Only those who dedicated everything to the holy flame could enter here. This is a holy and righteous tower, where only priests from various religious orders can be located. The next tower was the Lightning White Tiger Tower, which only those with the rage to slay anything could enter. And in this tower live those who come from knightly houses. These people are prepared to follow 2 roads, chivalry and magic. Next door there was a Tower of a Black Turtle, which saw the past and the future. Only those with limitless patience could enter this tower. Here there are various people, townspeople, servants, slaves, clowns, beggars, merchants, and new nobles of the lower class. Unlike other dorms, they are simply ignored due to their low status. Therefore, almost all the newcomers who got into this tower were intimidated, and no one wanted to talk or communicate with them. However, there is always an exception, and it was Li Kun, in whose eyes they are ideal business partners. It seemed to him that he needed to make friends with them, because he believed that the easiest way to earn money was to run a business, and to succeed, you need experience. This is the basis of running a business. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a voice unknown to him, which said that he simply did not understand why there was a need to accept such low-grade people. And this was a guy from a fairly high-status family who clearly considered himself better than them. Li Han didn't understand how he even dared to mock his future business comrades, so he immediately decided to answer him that if anyone here is low-grade, it's him. The guy once again decided to remind them that they left behind everything they owned before coming here, but apparently they forgot about it and continued to be insolent. Some guys from other houses knew that he was from the Vardhanaz house, and such behavior was worthy for him, so they supported him. Li Han believed that this was a good atmosphere, and now all he had to do was finish what he started. But the guys from the Dark Turtle Tower suddenly started screaming because they realized the fact that this guy was from the House of Vardhanaz, who in their opinion was incredibly dangerous. And all this was because they heard that their patriarch was a dragon, and also that their family originated from ancient spirits, who were always a great danger. Li Kun did not expect quite such a reaction, but Yenna thought that this was normal, because he is a man of noble blood. He didn't quite understand why she was saying this. Did he really look that scary? She didn't really mean it. She told him that he showed the nobility that is characteristic of a nobleman. But even after that, Li Han didn't quite understand what he was talking about, because he didn't know how famous his family was yet. Before Li Kun had time to ask Yenna another question, they were suddenly interrupted by Gainando, who did not understand how they could leave him alone and asked to urgently return to him. They were not against doing this, and on the way, Li Kun would like to find out from the girl a little more about what she had just tried to tell him about this strange night. Yenna immediately told him that the matter here was only about his mother, which was unexpected for Li Kun. One day, Yenna ran unsolicited into an imperial banquet, where she quite accidentally poured her drink on a woman. As it turned out later, this woman was an empress, and the little girl began to understand that it seemed like the end of the Macon house, and other people at this ball believed that the fact that she was a girl did not justify her action. But the empress herself did not think so, who took the little girl in her hand and told her that there was nothing wrong with it. And besides, all people make mistakes in life. But then it turned out that Yenna made up this whole story especially for Li Kun, and in fact the prince pays her a lot of money for being friendly with him. Li Kun decided that if this was the case, then he also urgently needed to make friends with this prince. While the guys were walking around the territory of the academy, they could not believe that it could be so huge, because there was a lake, a forest, and even small mountains. Li Kun now understood what the directors were talking about when he tried to convey to them that they should get everything themselves. Suddenly they stopped, and Li Kun decided to ask Yenny what was the matter, because it seemed to him that they needed to go further, and then they would find themselves in the Tower of the Blue Dragon. But as it turned out, they were just following other guys who stopped to look at something special, which also amazed Li Kun. It was a small and incredibly poor tower, which apparently is one of the dormitories. But it was not clear who it was for, apparently for slaves and servants. At least that's what people from famous families said. But as it turned out, it was the Tower of the Blue Dragon, where they would live. Gainando could not believe his eyes, because the chambers of his servants were much larger than this tower. Lihan was more interested in the fact that it was very small for so many people, so they were unlikely to fit in. But as soon as he stepped into this tower, at some point everything around disappeared and his body seemed to be transported to some additional space. He didn't fully understand what was going on here until he heard someone's rather strange voice telling him welcome. And then the most interesting thing happened. This strange voice decided to ask Li Kan where he was going, and where did he go? After this question, Li Kan began to understand what was going on and what was happening. As expected in the Magic Academy, the dormitory is a magic tower, so Li Han decided to first clarify where he could send him. This magical guide immediately noticed that the guy adapts quite quickly and it's quite pleasant to watch. In any case, Li Kan was informed that right now the only places he could go were his room, and the second option is the iron breaking room, exclusive for first years. Li Kan decided to notice that in the future there will be other places where you can go. And this strange voice confirmed this information, and also added that for some places you only need to know their name, and for others you will need to know something that they won't know other. But this voice immediately made him understand that this would not happen for now, if only because the director forbade him to do this, so the guy had to ask to be taken to the room. This magical assistant accepted his wish and carried him into the room, simultaneously saying, "Welcome to the academy, young magician." After some time getting acquainted with the rules of the academy, Li Har realized that with the exception of key subjects, the rest of the classes can be taken by choice, and they will be given a month of time to decide. He also learned that the director's name was Osu Gonadalts, and this prompted the guy to think that, in fact, everything here was not so strict. In this academy it was easier than in the graduate school that was offered to him. Besides, he liked everything here, because at least here the rooms are very spacious and they have absolutely everything you need. But only Li Kan thought so. His friends whom he met believed that this was a damned place, and there was absolutely nothing in the rooms that they needed. At this point, the rules were clear to the guy, so he thought about why he shouldn't find out what classes others had signed up for. In the restroom, he met with Yenna, from whom he wanted to find out what she would like to study, to which she confidently answered him that most of all she would like to study alchemy. Since the girl had always been interested in her, and her dream was to establish her own workshop and supply products to the imperial family, for Li Han it sounded quite profitable. As soon as she heard that the guy liked this idea, she immediately invited him to work with her, but according to him, alchemy is a rather difficult business, and he needs to think about it. The alchemy industry in the Empire is highly competitive, from spreading bad rumors about competitors to monopolizing elixir ingredients, with countless guilds fighting for market share. His thoughts were interrupted by a girl who would like to ask him what subject interests him. This question put the guy a little at a dead end, but mentally he always understood that he would choose a subject that would be less in demand and easier to learn. Therefore, his main goal was to become an imperial officer. In other words, a civil servant. The field was not really important to him. Grades and qualifications mattered. He believed that such a passionate girl would be upset if she heard such things, so for now he did not tell her this. And he decided to say that for now he was planning to try everything first, within a month, because he was sure that it was better not to rush with important decisions. And while he was talking about this, Gainando ran out to them, who was literally shouting about that they have big problems. And the thing was that it seemed to him that a thief had been in his room, because everything had disappeared from there. It was completely empty. But somehow no one paid attention to his screams, because they all understood that in fact this was normal. The next day they had their first lesson in basic magic, and Licker understood perfectly well that this was the main subject in the first year of study. But at that moment he was thinking that everyone in the dorm has their own preference for how to spend their free time, but he still didn't understand what was wrong with all of them. Ina didn't understand why he was so cheerful, because they were all just hungry, and besides, their beds were incredibly uncomfortable, so they didn't get enough sleep. Leisha really didn't understand why it was so difficult for them, because compared to their previous life, these were flowers. He always remembered the time when he was told that he would have to spend the allotted time for lunch at work, and so that he would not be so sad, he was given an energy bar. Likar didn't really know how to react to this, because it seemed to him that this was already some kind of slavery. Therefore, he actually had something to compare with, and in this place, it was several times better. Finally, the guys approached their audience, and they were so grateful to the gods that it was on the first floor. But as soon as they opened the doors, their happy faces immediately changed. They literally began to fall over in shock because of what they saw there. They were sure that this was their audience, but there the troll woman scared them so much. Trolls are fierce and dangerous monsters. notorious even to aristocrats who are very concerned about their safety. And yet, knowing this, Lihar also could not believe that in their audience there was a troll dressed in ordinary clothes, who was also glad to see them, and invited each of them to sit down in their seats. Although they were not sure of their safety, they still occupied all the free seats in this lecture hall. After which this woman introduced herself as Garcia, and she is a half-breed. She also immediately assured them that their fear was understandable to her. But they had nothing to fear, because according to her, she does not eat people. But then she changed her mind and said that this would happen until she got very hungry. Now Lihar had to tense up a little because he didn't understand whether she would eat them in the end or not. Of course it was a joke, but she immediately regretted saying it, because the faces of these guys became even paler. In any case, it's time for them to start the lecture, and she started it with the fact that most of them have never used magic before. This is due to the fact that it is extremely dangerous, and therefore only adults are allowed to use it. But she was in a hurry to please them that they were magic seeds that received the title of iron. So the purpose of her lecture was to explain the essence of magic, and also to help them determine what type of magic they were predisposed to. She immediately warned them that the path to magic is very difficult and harsh, but she wants to become a compass for them that will show them the way. Likan was very surprised that not all the professors here looked like the director. Garcia, meanwhile, decided to start from the very beginning and therefore wanted to find out from them what magic is. One girl decided to answer that this is what magicians use to change the world with their will. Garcia noted that this is a good answer, but still she wanted to add a little that this uses magical energy, also known as mana, the fundamental force for changing the world, and those who entered the academy are talented enough to sense this energy and recognize it. Garcia also did not forget to say that to use mana, you will need to summon magical energy with your will and carefully weave it together to cast a spell. Garcia believed that it was widely believed that this required singing or speaking, but in reality their own will was much more important, so she asked them not to forget about it. After which she said that she had actually already told them a lot, so she invited them to try it on themselves, and for this they need to get up from their seats and take out their wands, which should help them collect magical energy. Likan was most of all glad about this, because finally they will be able to use magic. Garcia told them that while they were holding the energy, she wanted them all to imagine light in their heads. For some guys it was too difficult, no matter how hard they tried, but it was very difficult to imagine. In general, Yenny had the thought in her head that it felt like you were pulling on the reins of a wild, rushing horse, and if you lost concentration, even for a second, it would dissipate. Garcia at that moment continued to say that while they were concentrating on not letting the energy dissipate, she suggested that they cast a spell. The text of the spell contained only one word, light, but after Garcia said it, the entire lecture hall was literally seated. According to the teacher, the spell can be anything that comes to their mind, but she asked them to keep in mind that it is easier to pay attention to a short word. Likan decided to structure this whole process a little in his head, and the first point was that he needed to collect magical energy. The second point was to turn it with his will, and the third point was to cast a spell. Having completed all these points, he succeeded and his wand literally shone, but Likan still believed that this was not enough. But the other guy's success was far from better. Some had sticks falling out of their hands, others had only some sparks instead of light. In general, Gainando's magical energy acts on its own, and he could not control it. Therefore, Garcia decided to help him a little and extinguished his magic, which he no longer controlled. Then she added to him that if he loses control, then the magic can rebel and harm someone. But to prevent this from happening, she is there, so she allowed them to practice and not worry about anything. The second attempt for the guys was no more successful, because they never managed to do anything even close to what Garcia asked of them. Although the woman herself knew very well that the light spell is the simplest, mastering it usually takes more than a month of practice, so she was not surprised that they had no way to do it. But still, she believed that students should cope on their own, so she would not tell them about it. It came to the seventh attempt, where there was only one student left who was still at least somehow trying to do what was asked. And this student was Likan, who raised his hand to ask if he needed to continue, because as you could see, the majority had already given up and he was left alone. Garcia was actually amazed that he was still standing and making his seventh attempt, because she knew very well that even if a first year has a lot of magical energy, they usually only last 5 attempts. In the East, some tribes call magical energy quite unusually. They call it chi. Scientists who like to show off call it ether, and some stubborn priests call it divine energy. This phenomenon, which goes by many names, is essentially the source of the magician's power, since each time they cast a spell, it must be used. It goes without saying that young novice magicians are often faced with a lack of magical energy. However, Garcia could not tell that he looked tired, despite the fact that he was trying for the 7th time. So she asked him to tell him his name, and the guy introduced himself as Lihan. and the fact that he said the first name and not the family name gained the favor of the professor, who I saw a student not trying to stand out. Therefore, with a smile, she asked him to come forward so that she could examine Likhan in more detail. As soon as he was next to her, she immediately asked him to give him her hand, which he did without any problems. After which Garcia's face changed, because she could not believe that she was seeing something like that. After touching his hand, her body seemed to plunge into a huge ocean. Likhan felt that something was wrong, so he called the professor to find out what happened. She told him that everything was fine and offered to return to class, although she couldn't even mentally imagine what it was all about. At this time, Gainando offered Yenny to save Likhan, because it seemed to him that she could really eat him. She told him that everything was fine, but still asked him to come to her after class, to which he rather reluctantly agreed. After which she addressed everyone with the words that she was sure that they all felt how easily the energy could run out. But still she asked them not to worry, because with practice, the amount of energy would increase, and they would spend it all each time less and less. She decided that it was necessary to say once again that she does not eat people so that everyone would understand this, after which she notified everyone that the lecture was over for today and they had all worked hard. After class, Likhan, as the professor asked, went into her office and he was immediately interested to know why she called only him. She told him that, to be honest, she heard about him even before the lecture from the director. This surprised the guy very much, because he didn't even think that that lich remembered him. She noticed that he was clearly starting to worry, and Garcia immediately decided to calm him down, saying that he really had nothing to worry about. She also told him that it may seem, of course, that the director has a little problem in his head, but in fact he is very kind. She told him that the students don't know this, but the director has a keen eye for people, and every year he tells the professors about new students. For example, last year he talked about beast people, who in his opinion are more capable than just burning down a dormitory, and also about a half-demon, next to whom you need to carefully use holy magic. But this year he talked about Likhan, about whom he said that the guy has the qualities of a huge fool. Garcia didn't understand what he was talking about and why he called the guy a huge fool, because she didn't know how to understand it. But as it turned out later, in the East there is an expression that what seems ignorance can be associated with wisdom. And in fact he wanted to say that he saw in him the qualities thanks to which Likhan would greatly succeed. Therefore Garcia became interested in finding out what kind of student this was, and she had high expectations about Likhan. That's why she called him to her office, but, on the other hand, she understood that she couldn't tell him all this. Therefore she decided to say that she asked him to come in because she saw that he had too much magical energy for a first year. Likhan, of course, was happy about this, but he still didn't understand why she called him for a personal conversation, because this could have been discussed in a lecture class. But then she still told him that he didn't just have a little more of her. He had so much of her that even she couldn't imagine where her limit ended. Now Likhan understood why she called him straight into the office, and didn't say it in front of everyone. The amount of magical energy is a decisive factor for a magician. If there is not enough of it, then one has to use intricate methods to draw out more, and the presence of a large amount of energy, in turn, frees one from such restrictions. In other words, this indicates great talent. Likhan at that moment understood that if the professor was telling the truth, then a bright road to the future was prepared for him. But she suddenly stopped his joy and suddenly said that it was such a pity. Likhan didn't quite understand what she meant and why she suddenly felt sorry. Was it really a bad thing to have a lot of energy? Garcia, not particularly joyful, replied that having a lot of energy is actually not bad, but the guy has too much of it, which worries her a little. Therefore, she decided to explain to him using the example of a glass of water. While the water is contained in the vessel, it is easier to control it. However, if he needs to control an entire sea, then it will be much more difficult. Likhan seems to have begun to understand that the complexity of controlling magical energy, which is the basis, in his case, is at an unreasonably high level. While he was panicking, Garcia decided to put a bracelet on him, which she said would help with this. According to her, he absorbs magical energy and should help him a little. Likhan realized that as long as the bracelet was on him, there should be no problems. But she immediately upset him again, because it would not be entirely logical to call him here, if the problem was solved so simply. Garcia told him that the bracelet would help him if he used a lot of spells to drain his energy. And there was good news for him. She allowed him to practice on his own, since nothing would happen if his energy was depleted. But Likhan was not entirely happy with such an offer, but still thanked her. After he left her office, the only thought in his mind was that now his future looks a little bleak, and from now on he needs to keep all his grades up. Therefore, he decided to once again ask his friends if they had decided on any activities. Ina decided that she would attend a course in alchemy and invited them to go with her. Gainando immediately decided to say that alchemy is actually a servant's job and he doesn't understand what is being taught at all, so it seemed to him that Ina was stupid. Likhan immediately realized that the prince had said this in vain, because Yenna had already asked him to move away so that she could get closer to this smart guy. A few seconds later, she dealt him a precise blow right in the face, simultaneously telling him that he would never dare ask her for medicine again if he suddenly ended up in the hospital. Li-han knew a little about fighting thanks to Arlog's fencing lessons, and in his humble opinion, it was a 10 out of 10 blow that Gainando will remember for a long time. But still, he was not entirely sure that the prince could be beaten like that. But the girl assured him that in fact, everything was fine. She would only need to ask him for forgiveness the next day. Li Kun realized that it looked like this. This is not the first time this has happened. Suddenly they stopped, because they saw that in front of them there were a lot of students from other towers, and especially from the Black Turtle, and it was not entirely clear what they were doing here. Li Kun, of course, actually didn't care at all, but their views worried him incredibly much. He knew that peasants usually have two ways to react to the appearance of a nobleman. They are either afraid because they do not want to get involved with him, or they demonstrate hostility, as for example they do towards Li Kun, whom they feared because of his last name. The guy himself was well aware of the fact that if he behaved too friendly, it could backfire on him. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a rather familiar voice, and it seemed it was the professor. For all the kids at the academy, after the Lich director and the half-troll professor, it wasn't strange to see another quirky professor. But this professor wasn't that special. He was just an ordinary old gnome. His name was Yurgulm Gomdar, but he allows his students to address him as Professor Yurgulm. He was sure that they all had the same thought. They have such a majestic academy, but for some reason they gathered in a clearing where there is not a single desk. Why is that? The princess raised her hand again and decided to say that they did this in order to feel the mana of nature and understand what forces existing in nature are important for the alchemist. Yurgulm looked at her with incomprehension because this was the wrong answer. Yenna and Li Kun were talking at that time, and the guy said that he seemed to have an answer, but he wasn't completely sure of it. But still, he decided to say that perhaps this was an excellent place to collect materials, and this was the correct answer, which greatly pleased the professor. Yurgulm praised Li Kun for his sharp mind and added that this would greatly help him in the future. Li Kun at that moment was thinking that it would probably be better to miss the fact that he simply pointed his finger at the sky and guessed right, and mentally he asked not to see me as a rival. Yurgulm interrupted his thoughts and asked each student to pay attention to him, because the real reason that they gathered here is that here he can teach you the most important things about alchemy. He was also sure that they believed that alchemy required exceptional intelligence and the ability to control magic well. But in reality, this is far from reality, because in fact the most important skill for an alchemist is gathering resources. After this, the girl decided to point out the fact that resources can actually be created by yourself or ordered from others. So she believed that there was no point in saying that collecting resources was the most important thing. Hearing this, the other students noticed that in fact Her Highness was right. Why should they extract resources at all? But this only angered Yurgulm more, who began to shout at her because he believed that she knew nothing at all about the real world. He believed that she couldn't even grow 10% of the resources she needed on her own, and the ones she orders will be unusable. So the reason they travel with adventurers is because they are stupid asses when it comes to digging up herbs. They will ruin valuable specimens. Therefore, he was now trying to explain to them that an alchemist must know how to independently obtain resources, and if they cannot do this, then they will never become great alchemists. After which he summed it up, saying that this explanation should be enough, and invited them to finally move on to practice, and each of them had a picture of the plant in front of their face that they would need to bring to him. It was strange for Li-han to read that it was a corrupted herb that was used in creating antidotes, so he decided to ask Yenna if she had ever worked with it. Around Einrogard, despite his prestige, there are a lot of unpleasant rumors, and one of the rumors says that while learning magic, people die. Of course, it was clear to Li Kun that magic was dangerous, and incidents were inevitable. But it was a matter of insufficient preparation. He did not understand why send students to such places. So they decided that he and Yenna needed a third person to go to that forest, and Li Kun offered to take Her Majesty with them, who apparently also became interested in alchemy. It seemed to Yen that strict princess had a rather complex character, so she was not entirely sure that taking her with her was a good idea. But Lian decided to remind her once again that they were just looking for herbs, that's all. But when they looked in her direction, they realized that apparently they were too late, because she had already gathered a team with which to go into the forest. But what confused Li-han the most was that there were people from the Black Tower who had successfully bypassed him. Yenna noticed that the princess was quite popular before entering the academy. Other members of the imperial family know her because of her intelligence and talent. She is everyone's favorite star, so everyone follows her, regardless of her title. But still, Li Kun noticed the fact that those who had already found a place in the teams left, Only the students from the Black Turtle Tower remained. And yet he understood that even if they hated him, it was still too dangerous to go together. So he believed that they needed someone capable to cover their weaknesses. Therefore, he turned his gaze to a rather unusual girl who seemed to be an elf. This girl's name was Nilya. She was from the Black Turtle Tower, because she herself was a dark elf and a member of the Shadow Watch of the patrol police of the northern part of the Empire. And the Shadow Watch is a group of experienced hunters and scouts who are located on the northern mountain range and know its territory as your 5 fingers. Therefore, it was quite obvious that it would not be difficult for her to find such a plant, although she honestly admitted that this was the first time she had heard about the desecrated grass. But it would not be difficult to find it. She was sure of it. In her mind, Nilya thought that the forest was like a playground for her, and she was actually surprised when she saw so many capable newcomers. But in any case, she believed that now it was her turn to prove herself. Suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by Yenna, who introduced herself, and Lihan, who were so glad to meet her. She immediately noticed the fact that Lihan did not say which house he was from, but she immediately wanted to know who they were and what they wanted from her. In response to this, Yenna immediately invited her to go to the mountains with them. Ninya ignored this proposal and wanted to find out what they really needed from her, because she knew very well that all nobles were the same. They insult everyone, calling them savages, and even if you show them kindness, they will complain about mistreatment, and therefore she saw no reason why these two should be different. Likan entered into this dialogue and tried to reassure her that they really came to invite her to go into the forest together, because he believed that walking there alone was quite dangerous in case a monster appeared there. But she immediately told them that she didn't need their help, and therefore Likan would like to know why. Although, without waiting for her answer, he asked her if she really thought that they wanted to use her as bait or abandon her. The girl couldn't believe it. How did he even know about it? But still, she didn't show it and simply told him that she wanted to go alone. But this alarmed Likan even more, because who normal would go into that forest alone? Therefore, he was sure that this was not the main reason, because she could not know what would happen in the forest. And besides, she needed to collect resources and bring them. And in the end, he added that he was sure that she was not stupid, and understood perfectly well that she was unlikely to cope alone. All these words angered her even more, so at one point she finally shouted and asked him to stop, because she was already ready to go with them, if only he would shut up. Likan was very happy that she agreed, but Yenna simply didn't understand what he was taught at home. Where did he get such manipulation skills? While Likan and Yenna were on the ground, Ninya did not miss the opportunity and jumped through the trees. And now Yenna was sure that she was an experienced hunter, and she would like to know how Lihan found out about this. The guy explained that he noticed the fact that her calf muscles are quite well developed, and she also has calluses on her palms, because she often uses a bow. Such signs can only indicate that she is a hunter. Ninya perfectly heard everything the guy said, and she was also surprised that he understood who she was only after noticing these signs. She also noticed the fact that he had a strange aura floating around him, as if he was able to read minds. But then he suddenly said that he was just joking, and added that he saw a Shadow Watch badge on her belt. Yenna suddenly interrupted him and asked Ninya to go with them and not drive them away, but she didn't understand why she should do this. Likan answered her that in fact only Yenna can distinguish between herbs, so if she falls from fatigue, the two of them will have to cope. But Ninya could not answer anything. But still, she asked Likan why they needed him, because she can find grass, and she is a guide, and he is of no use. Likan understood that she was actually right. He was useless in this case, but this could not be said under any circumstances, so he decided to say that he was protecting them. She told him that she immediately noticed that he was well built and probably from the House of Knights, but then she didn't understand why he lives in the Blue Tower. Likan answered her that he was not from the House of Knights, but from the House of Vardanaz. The guy believed that this was his best chance to get closer. But apparently he was wrong, because from the girl's reaction it was clear that she was too scared. The girl literally began to panic because she didn't expect to hear that he was really from the Vardanaz house, which she was so afraid of. And now she didn't even know what to tell him. Lihan decided to clarify with Yen what was wrong with his house, and she noticed the fact that there were false rumors about all the houses of aristocrats. But his house seemed to her to be a special case. As far as the girl knew, they say about the guy's house that the patriarch of the house, Vardanaz, is a dragon, who, during an incident with the maddened undead, burned them to the ground with his fiery breath. It was also known that the house of Vardanaz is connected by blood with ancient spirits, because of which the members of the house have incredible abilities, in return losing their emotions. So everyone believed that this house does not know pity, and the magicians of this house, who appeared to quell the unrest, wiped out the city faces of the earth. Likan had no idea that there were such legends about his house. That is, they have the image of those who, if something happens, will turn into monsters and sweep away everything in their path. But he still didn't understand why only his house was so special. Because on the other hand, magicians should help people, and not destroy them. And so Yenna asked him not to dwell on this and move on with his life. Looking at all this, Ninya realized that she certainly doesn't know what about the rest, but the gossip that they have no emotions is definitely false. Therefore, she still continued on her way with them, but only with one condition. She asked him to stop whining, otherwise he would go on alone, and Lee Khan had no choice but to agree with this. After some time of walking through the forest, she suddenly stopped and jumped down to them, simultaneously asking them to stop as well. After which she asked them to pay attention to what was behind the bush, and there one could see quite large traces of some kind of animal, and even worse, a monster. Ninya also did not forget to add that since they are shallow, it seems to her that they were left by an animal that is able to control its strength in order to hide its tracks. But looking at her fellow travelers, she realized that they were actually not interested in this at all, although they were trying to pretend otherwise. And so she realized that she was getting carried away again, and would unlearn it for now, because such things only interested the villagers. So she told them that it was really not that important. But before she had time to say this, Lee Khan approached her and asked if she could find out anything else by looking at these traces. It was so unexpected that the girl couldn't even say a word in response to it. She just couldn't believe the fact that he was really curious, so she asked him again. Lee Han didn't quite understand why she was asking this, if he had just asked her to do it. Ninya explained to him that he was from a big house, which is why she thought it was so strange. Then she added that when you come across such traces, it is best to be careful. After all, one could notice that this animal not only has large claws, but one can also predict what kind of creature lives here. But it is still very difficult, because as far as Ninya heard, quite a diverse fauna lives around the school. And she was right, because the territory of Einregard is really rich in magical energy, which affects the land, so different types of monsters converge here. Of course, Ninya did not forget to add that there are also monsters created during experiments and monsters that appeared from discarded elixirs, such as strangely shaped slugs. Lee Han, listening to all this, could not help but notice that there were clearly big security problems here. But suddenly Ninya suggested changing their plan, and instead she wanted to follow these tracks, so she believed that they would have less chance of being ambushed. Lee Khan was not against such an idea, but he also wanted to ask her for something, namely, that she would teach him to read the tracks. She immediately answered him that it was actually not as easy as it seemed to him, and most likely he would quickly give up, but he assured her that if she taught him, he would do his best to learn it. Although Ninya was against this idea, she still told him that he could try. After some time, as they walked through this forest, they still managed to find the very grass that the professor asked them to bring. Ina just thought that they were out of luck, because so far they had only been able to find 2 pieces. But she still believed that they could quickly find another one. She was also sure that there was definitely no one else nearby, so they should move on. But no one answered her, so she decided to turn around and ask them what happened and why they were ignoring her. And there she saw a not very pleasant picture. In front of them stood a huge boar, who clearly did not intend to show them where the secret herb was. Lee Kun noticed that judging by the fact that he felt magical energy in it, this was not an ordinary boar. Ninya could have said without him that it was a monster, and they needed to come up with something urgently. The guy understood that this was too dangerous a situation for them, and so he began to take out his wand, because in fact he didn't have any other weapon. He decided that this was the perfect moment to use his wand. But since Lee Kun was not yet very good at magic, he decided that in this situation, it would be best if he changed the size of the wand, which was quite easy to do. Ninya immediately calmed down a little because she remembered that Lee Kun was from the House of Magicians, and this is not to mention the fact that his house is the best in the Empire. So she was sure that he must have learned a couple of spells before entering the academy. But still, she decided to ask him again if he was confident in his actions, but the guy was not quite ready to give her an answer to this question. Ninya turned to him and said that if he was not sure of his actions, then he should take his red-haired girlfriend and run, and she, in turn, would take him away from them. Yenna and Lihan couldn't believe their ears that she was so worried about them, but she believed that only she could do something like that. Lee Khan was very grateful to her and asked her to take care of him if the situation suddenly got out of control. In the meantime, he decided to try to fight this monster, and Ninya was incredibly interested in finding out what spell Lee Khan uses to defeat this boar. When Lihan was about 10 years old, he was told that the sword may be the king of all weapons, but he should not rely on it alone. He was taught that he must master different weapons in order to be ready for any situation. Only those who have achieved an understanding of the process can learn to pour mana into their weapons. This is called the aura mode. But his teacher then thought that when the boy grows up and learns the truth, he will be disappointed, because only a small number of gifted people can achieve this regime. And Lee Khan himself didn't understand why he was trying so hard, because he wants to become a magician who will work in the office. But he told his teacher that he was sure that there was a point in training. It seemed to him that they would help protect himself in the future. Arglo could not believe that their young master was not at all like other nobles who chase unrealistic dreams, so he was ready to guide him to the very end so that he would learn aura. And the incredibly hard training now should have helped Lee Khan cope with this monster, but he decided that a fight with this big guy was definitely not beneficial for him, so he decided to strike him with just one blow, but this blow was aimed directly at his mouth. After this blow, the girls even felt a little sorry for this boar, not to mention the fact that they were incredibly surprised by what Lee Khan decided to do. But be that as it may, this blow was accurate, and after it the boar fell, and apparently this was the end of its attack. Einrogard's wand is very strong and can be used as a club, but you can't defeat the monster like that. But Lee Khan still managed to do it, and all thanks to the fact that he used mana subconsciously, so he managed to overwhelm him. Ina couldn't understand why this lesson was so difficult. She was very tired during their hike, and a boar also attacked them. She just couldn't believe that the professor sent them to such a place, and they were still first years. But before she had time to finish speaking, they suddenly heard another roar, and it seemed like it was another boar rushing straight at them. They got closer and tried to follow this sound, and when they did this, they actually saw a boar there, which was trying to attack another group of students. There were many more people in this group than them, so they decided that they didn't need help. They definitely had to cope with so many people. Suddenly, one of them shouted that she would deal with this boar, and just like Lee Khan, she enlarged her magic wand, and this girl's name was Asen. Yenna recognized this girl almost immediately. It was her friend Asen from the Dalkit house. This house is renowned for its excellent and precise workmanship. If, for example, the House of Vardanaz played the role of advisor to the emperor for many generations, then the House of Dalkad played the role of chancellor and treasurer. Lihan had also heard a lot about this house. He knew that they were loyal people, and judging by her stance, she had studied fencing for a long time. Asen herself was confident that she would cope without any problems, because it seemed to her that she could predict all the movements of this boar. After which she went into battle and tried to land a precise blow on his body, but apparently her calculations turned out to be wrong, because this boar only received a bruise after her blow, after which he struck her with both legs, from which he successfully flew off. The monster was not going to stop there and continued to confidently attack other students. And if Her Highness had not come out in front of them, it was not entirely clear what the consequences would have been next. Yenna and Ninya were surprised that she stood up to protect the guys and did not save herself. At that moment, the young princess only thought that her plan would work perfectly if she did everything as she planned. She believed that if she could calculate his movements and attack him at the time, then perhaps she would be able to strike him with an accurate blow. But apparently she was wrong, because the boar was several times faster than she could have imagined. But before he had time to attack her, he suddenly fell unconscious, as if someone had dealt him a precise blow. Lee Khan could only exhale because now they were incredibly lucky that the boar never noticed him. Ninya believed that this incident should teach him the importance of approaching from the leeward side, and he, in turn, hoped that she would continue to give him such useful advice. The princess, to put it bluntly, did not expect to see Lee Khan Vardanaz here, but still she did not forget that she should thank him for his help. The guy immediately answered her that she didn't have to thank him, because in his place anyone would do the same. The only thing Ninya didn't understand was why they addressed each other so formally. Isn't familiarity supposed to be the norm between classmates? His Majesty promised Lee Khan that she would definitely repay him. Then Lee Khan decided to immediately ask her for a favor, since she wanted to thank him so much. She did not expect such a turn of events and did not even guess what he would need from her, but still allowed him to speak. Lee Khan's request was that he asked her to recommend him a subject where it would be easy to get good grades. And he asked her for this not in vain, because he knew very well that she had many connections in the academy. The girl did not expect such a request, and at first did not know how to answer this question. She literally did not understand what he wanted to say by this. She was also confused by the fact that a member of the Vardanaz house was interested in the activity for the sake of grades. Was he really testing her? Suddenly they heard some outside voice that turned to Lee Khan and told him that he knew what item could be ideal for the guy. As soon as he heard this voice, he immediately had a bad feeling. It was a trembling in his body that was so familiar to him, and the atmosphere itself was heating him up. An alchemy teacher suddenly appeared behind him, who frightened him incredibly and at the same time reminded him that this was an alchemy class. And in the guy's head, there were only thoughts that it was as if he had met his professor from a past life. But then he immediately asked himself to calm down and come to his senses, because there was no reason to be so nervous. In addition, he himself has quite a lot of life experience and he is no longer the immature student he was then. Therefore, he gathered his strength and answered the professor that his occupation seemed good to him if he had enough enthusiasm and dedication. But in response, he received only a malicious answer from the professor, who promised him that the guy would have both enthusiasm and passion. But with this, the professor ended his speech, and with it, the lesson itself, so Lee Khan could finally exhale calmly. Although he still did not forget to add that he was sorry that other groups did not meet these guys. Asen could not believe that he sent them to them on purpose. The professor did not understand this question. Did they really think that he only sent them to pluck the grass? According to him, the purpose of the activity was to allow them to encounter different situations while they search for herbs. And it really didn't matter whether they caught the boar, avoided it, ran away or hid. The alchemist must be able to cope with such unexpected circumstances. Ina was a little upset that they didn't need that desecrated grass, because they actually went through a lot to find her and the three of them did it together, all together. The professor's face immediately changed. He could not believe his eyes that they had actually managed to find this flower. After which he ran up to them and assured them that they had actually pulled out the golden ticket. And it also seemed to him that they had a talent for alchemy. And as soon as the opportunity presented itself, he whispered in Lee Khan's ear that, as he had said, the guy should attend his classes. The guy didn't want to upset the professor, so he answered him that he would try to attend all classes, because as it turned out he always dreamed of doing alchemy, although mentally he simply resigned himself to reality. The man himself, looking at this guy, still saw something mature in him, because children at his age are usually rebellious. But this guy is completely different. So he told him that since he had defeated the boar and found the corrupted grass, he decided to give him a special privilege. The man began to tell him that he had a hut near the forest, and he allowed him to come there this semester whenever the guy wanted. Lee Khan didn't quite understand why he came to this hut, and what kind of work this old man wanted to load him with. Looking at the expression on Lee Khan's face, the professor realized that he probably should explain himself, because some guys might misunderstand him. And for this, he decided to first ask them what they think the first-year students want most, to which they immediately answered that everyone only wanted food and the man agreed with them. And he also added that because of this, the students looked a little gloomy, and within a week he assured them that riots would begin. Lee Khan completely agreed with him, because no one could survive on such food for a long time. Besides, only nobles live in his tower, and in this regard it is even worse, because none of them are used to starving. And the man was telling all this for a reason. Because as it turned out a little later, this hut is full of fresh ingredients for cooking, as well as spices and vegetables that he personally chose. For Lee Khan at that moment this meant the same thing as a free pass to an unlimited buffet. Therefore the guy even wanted to shake his hand and say that the man was the best professor in this academy, and the man could not help but praise the guy in return. But most of the guys didn't think so, because at least he sent a boar at them, and therefore they will never return to this activity again, because next time they might die. Although Lee Khan did not think so, because in fact it was not as surprising for him as for the others. So for him now, in fact, the main thing was to get food, which is what he and his new team were doing. The guy, of course, knew how to prepare meat for consumption, because his master taught him in childhood, but it would obviously be difficult for him to cope with this boar alone, and he understood this perfectly well. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Yenna, who offered him her help, if he didn't mind, of course. Lee Khan thought that she didn't look well, so he decided to ask her again if she could cope. To which the girl confidently answered him that of course she would do it, if of course he then shared food with her. Ninya could not believe that they, as nobles, were going to cut up this boar, because it seemed to her that they would not be able to do it. In response to this, Lee Khan invited her to do the division together. Then she would receive her share of the meat from this boar. Without thinking for a long time, she agreed to this, and immediately invited them to show what the huntress was capable of. As it turned out later, Nilya is a professional in this matter, and Yenna came from a home where they know how to handle various materials, with which Lee Khan was incredibly lucky. In addition, the professor was not against providing them with his tools, with which they could cut up the body of the boar, for which Lee Khan was incredibly grateful to him. After a few seconds, they laid a blanket and closed the eyes of this animal, and also took the tools in their hands and were ready to start cutting up. Nilya, looking at Lee Khan, thought that he was actually better, she thought. Apparently in Vardhanaz's house they taught him similar things. Lee Khan decided to tell them that after skinning they would cut the meat into pieces, then hang them on branches, and with the help of the intestines they would make sausages. The guy was mentally thinking that he didn't know how long this damn life would last, so he decided that he needed to take care of long-term supplies. Therefore they were able to make quite a lot of different preparations, and the professor was even impressed by the fact that the guy decided to process it all with smoke, which most first-year students do not do. In addition, he believed that this was very important because no matter what the weather, meat can easily spoil, so smoke treatment is just a great solution. Mentally, the man could not believe that the guy could go so far, although he had only been at school for 3 days and worked with meat like a real professional, so the professor never ceased to be surprised by him. His thoughts were interrupted by Lee Khan, who was interested to know if the man was hungry, to which he received a small answer. The guy decided to make a small exchange and therefore asked the man for butter and bread, and they gave him meat in return, which the professor simply could not disagree with. A few minutes later, the table was set, and there was a sea of delicious food on it, which each of them missed. There was even jam, which Professor Yorgulma brought as a bonus. Ina decided to be the first to try this jam, and after a few seconds she simply could not leave it. It was too tasty, which was quite pleasant for the man to hear. Well-cooked meat, sweet jam, rich, buttered bread, a peaceful, calm river, new friends. This is how Lakin's third day at the Magic Academy passed. After they ate, even after processing with smoke, they were left with a lot of unprocessed meat, and they did not fully know what to do with it. A solution to this problem was suggested to them by Nelia, who said that perhaps they should share this meat with other guys at the academy. Likan immediately thought that he could sell them this meat, and it was just a great idea, although this was not what Nelia proposed. The guy immediately began to say that most students from the Blue Tower have a lot of money, and this will not be a problem for them. Likan's motto was, plow like a horse to live in abundance, and Yena's motto was, save every coin for the workshop. So they are different from the others, but both are incredibly similar to each other. Nelia couldn't fully understand this, and simply didn't fully believe that they really wanted to sell everything. They didn't understand why she was so surprised by this, and suggested that she do the same. But she's not like them, and so she immediately made it clear that she would give it away to her friends just like that. Likan believed that this was only her business, but it still seemed to him that she would later regret it, and Yena completely agreed with him. Friendship is actually temporary, but coins are eternal. At this time, she began to think that they had both talent and passion, but they looked like those who should expect trouble. The overdimensional Blue Dragon Tower is located away from the main building and always welcomes students with the scent of fresh leaves, but today was different. After all, Likan and Yena decided to have a picnic, although it was not entirely free. The guys had not eaten anything meat for too long, so it was clear from them that they were very hungry and would not mind having a snack. Likan asked them to come in and sit down, because they had prepared it especially for them, so they shouldn't be shy and stand still. The guys couldn't believe their luck. They were literally drooling when they saw the fried meat. But before they were about to sit down, Likan warned them that first they must each give a silver coin. It was too meager for them. They didn't even think before giving the money, because in fact they couldn't even remember how much time had passed since they ate meat. It literally immediately dissolved in their mouth, and some of them, they couldn't even believe that they shared something so precious with them. Lihan did not even expect that their business would go so well, because according to his calculations, they earned 3 times more than it would have cost outside the academy. But, on the other hand, they didn't even feel sorry, because they understood that it was almost impossible to get meat in these parts. So this was a pretty fair price, as it seemed to them. Gainando just woke up. He probably slept for more than a day, but all this screaming woke him up, so he still went out to see what was happening. His thoughts were filled with food. It even seemed to him that he would soon die from hunger strike. And then he saw beautiful pieces of meat that seemed to be waiting for him. Likan interrupted his stupor and suggested that he go get something to eat, because he was probably hungry. The guy couldn't believe his luck that he could eat it too. There was no need to ask him for a long time, so he immediately sat down at the table and was about to bring the first piece of fried meat to his mouth. But he was stopped quite in time by Likan, who had previously demanded from him 1 silver coin for a piece of meat. Gainando did not expect that they would take money for it, although Lihan thought that he knew that the pride of the nobles is not to take something for free. But unfortunately, Gainando did not have any money at all, and this is due to the director, who unfortunately threw it away all his wealth. Likan didn't want to leave the guy without a piece of meat, so he invited him to sign a loan agreement, which obliges him to pay back the money later, but with a small additional payment. Gainando, without even thinking, wrote his name into this agreement, and then burst into tears with happiness that he had such a wonderful friend as Likan, who would finally feed him. The guy was eating a piece of meat and thinking about how lucky he was to make friends with such a wonderful person. Now it seemed to him that he had a great understanding of people. It seemed to him until the end that he had finally found real friends who cared about him. It was a happy day for everyone in the area. The next day they were scheduled to study basic magical symbols, but this activity seemed so useless to most because they believed that the nobles did not need such classes. They were already very smart and educated in this regard. Lihan, listening to all this, didn't even think that people could lie to themselves so sincerely, when suddenly their conversations and thoughts were interrupted by the fact that the study room was closed and then filled with green light, which was accompanied by a very familiar voice that wished all the students good morning. Likan couldn't believe his ears. He really didn't want this voice to be what he was thinking about. But unfortunately, his worst fears came true. The director was the professor of magical symbols. The first thing the director began to say was that he saw how well they ate, although it seemed to him that they would need much more time to get food. One of the students suddenly asked him a question. Did he really think that they had to look for her themselves? The director made it clear to this guy with just one look that he said something wrong, and was glad that they were learning quite quickly and no longer asking him stupid questions. The Lich knew one thing, that newcomers come every year. But what remains constant is that the newcomers from the Blue Dragon Tower always remain the weakest and slowest. The fastest is usually the Black Turtle Tower, followed by the White Tiger Tower. Compared to them, the Blue Dragon Tower, which is full of high-ranking nobles who have never done anything difficult in their lives, has adapted the longest. But be that as it may, the guys adapted perfectly. But the director was not so stupid, and he understood perfectly well that at the head of this phenomenal device was no one other than Likan. The guy already very much regretted that he met the eyes of the directors, and the Lich himself at that moment thought that he was right when he thought that the guy was different from the others. Who could have known that someone so free would end up in this harsh faculty? The director was convinced that freedom is the most important thing a magician should have and therefore puts his students in extreme situations. And besides, it was quite entertaining for him to watch. When suddenly all his thoughts were interrupted by another student, who decided to ask the director why this lesson was needed. Leech noticed that this was a pretty good question, and decided to ask the guy what he thought it was for, but the student was not sure of his answer. Therefore, the director had to tell him that the fact is that when graduates cause trouble outside the academy, the damn emperor blames the director of this academy. According to him, they don't even imagine how many problems their senior comrades are causing. And this lecture on studying the symbol will be his justification when the envoy comes to talk about the assholes of the high school students. He won't be able to punish him for their deeds. The director really hoped that the student understood him and would now know why he needed this lecture. After which he added that magicians are unpredictable and asked them to talk about how they are different, because this would only infuriate him even more. He ordered them to immediately open their textbooks to the first page and forced them to start reading everything that was written there. They, like a flock of sheep, began to repeat everything that was written there, that they, as magicians, would never in their lives harm civilians using their magic. But this was too little for the director, so he ordered them to read it much louder so that other audiences could hear it. Lihan, doing all this, was not particularly happy because he was not entirely sure that it could even work. The director could only hope that today's lecture had stuck in their kind hearts. But in any case, it was time to start, and for this he would need 2 assistants. Likan, looking at his colleagues, noticed that each of them was looking away, and he knew perfectly well that the task would be difficult. The director immediately told them that if suddenly there were no volunteers, it would be even worse for them. After these words, Lihan stood up from his seat and decided that he agreed to be an assistant, because mentally he was sure that he would get credit for it somewhere. The director immediately came right up to him and asked the guy if he really liked standing out among people so much. Lihan decided to say that it was a great honor for him to help the professor whom he respects so much. The way the guy threw around empty compliments infuriated the director, but still, he added that opportunity comes only to those who are ready to take advantage of it. Now Likan was sure that the director guessed that the guy volunteered only for profit, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Gainando, who decided to check with Likan whether he had gone crazy. Because the prince believed that no one knew what this madman could do to him. But his words were suddenly interrupted by another guy who literally forbade Gainando to stop Likan because he had not gone crazy. In his opinion, he sacrificed himself for them. This provoked Gainando to start thinking that he should also get up and help his friend at this difficult moment. But just as he was about to say that he also wanted to be a volunteer, suddenly one of the students had already asked to be the second assistant. It was Asen, who raised his hand right in front of the prince and decided to become the second assistant. The director immediately recognized this guy because he is the Ironhead from the Dalcat house, whose family is good at working with documents. In response, the guy could only thank him for the compliment. Likan didn't understand why Asan also did this. Is he really also pursuing a similar goal? But apparently the guy was wrong, because Asan turned to Likan, and in this way, he wanted to repay him for his help in the forest. Likan immediately said that it was not worth going so far for this, but in response he only heard that his family always makes sure that everything is paid. Suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by the director, who of course was pleased to see that they were getting along with each other. But he would like to get to work. Using magic, he created 2 copies of the safety rules and asked the guys to copy them for the next lecture. But not just 1 copy, but 1 for each student. Asen simply could not believe that he was doing such things. He was really angry with every word of the security protocol. But what irritated him most was the fact that the professor forced them to do this nonsense when they could have been doing magic. Likan, looking at this guy, only hoped that he would not die while writing all this, because the guy actually began to guess what the director was up to. And Likan was almost sure that he thought something like use magic, if writing all this by hand bothers you so much. But the problem was that they couldn't even use basic spells to create light, let alone writing magic. Therefore, Likan was sure that if the director had even an ounce of conscience, then he had left a clue for them somewhere. Asen noticed that Lee Khan was not writing anything, and therefore decided to ask him what he was doing. Lee Khan explained to him that he was looking for a clue to resolve the situation. Maybe he would find something useful for himself. It seemed to Asen that this could not be done, and it looked more like some kind of theft. Although the guy reminded him that there are no rules that prohibit doing this. Besides, this is the director's lecture hall. Asen liked Lee Khan's way of thinking, so he still agreed with him and added that sometimes you can actually steal for your own benefit. So he suggested splitting up and searching together. The two of them began to search the director's desk, but so far neither of them had seen anything remarkable. But Lee Khan was sure that there must definitely be something. Suddenly, Lee Khan noticed a rather strange bedside table that glowed with a bright light. He immediately asked Asen to come here, because he had found a bedside table from which strange magical energy was emanating. Without thinking for long, they decided to open it and see what was inside. And as soon as they did this, the director climbed out of this box and looked at them. But Lee Khan immediately realized that this was not the real director. It was just an illusion spell that the director left as a hint for them. After which the director's illusion began to say that the fact that they opened the box meant that they had already finished with the meaningless work and began to use the heads for their intended purpose. He himself hoped that this would happen sooner rather than so late, because the later they discovered it, the worse they would look, having wasted so much time. After which he finally talked about the spell itself, which, according to him, belonged to the first circle, low-level manipulation, and he could advise them to learn it as soon as possible. At this point, his speech ended and he simply disappeared, leaving the guys alone with their guesses. Asen became even angrier because he didn't fully understand why the director decided to teach them a lesson in this way. Therefore, he offered to file a complaint against him together, because it seemed to him that if they acted together, then even the director would not be able to do anything to them. But Lee Khan didn't seem to listen to him. He read too carefully what the director left for them in that nightstand. After which he suddenly became distracted, and immediately told his friend that he could not help him with anything, because it seemed to him that complaints would not work against the insane director. And Asen actually understood this himself, because these were Einrogard's rules. Lee Khan suggested that he better practice magic, because they had everything they needed, and the ingredients of a good spell included will, gestures, and also a good spell for using low-level manipulation, which they began to do. But so far nothing has worked out for them, and the result they expected did not come to them. After some time and several dozen attempts, Asen ran out of mana, and Lee Khan suggested giving him a break. The guy himself understood perfectly well that magic is not a simple thing. It looked like light movements to him, but everyone collects energy differently. At moments it even seemed to him that he was like a clown performing in front of a bunch of people. But now is not the time for this, and he decided to convince himself that now he needed to concentrate and imagine that this was his last chance, as if there was a minute left before completing the task. He repeated in his head, straight as a serene bamboo tree but soft as a feather. Gathering all the strength and energy he controlled, he once again ordered the feather to move. And what a surprise it was when Lee Khan managed to do it and the feather was in the air at one moment. But this was still not enough, and Lee Khan understood this very well, so he decided that he needed to immediately force the pen to move towards the paper. Although as soon as he moved his hand, the feather shot out of the window like a bullet and broke it. Most likely he expected to see not such a result. Therefore, he decided to reread the paper on which this spell was described, and after a few minutes, he could notice that there were two difficult points in it. The first of them occurs when, after casting a spell, you need to continue to concentrate and control the object without stopping. But at this stage, he was able to finish the most difficult part of the spell, and now control should be easier. So he decided to try again, but this time with more control. Lee Khan tried to do everything as slowly and unhurriedly as possible, when suddenly the office doors began to open. And it was the director who came in and immediately began to say that if they wrote the norm, then they could be free, because then he would do everything himself, with the help of his magic. With this cry, he knocked down all the guy's concentration, and it turned out that this feather flew away again at the speed of a bullet. But this time it didn't hit the window, but straight into the director's head. The guys understood that this was most likely the end of him, which came so quickly after entering the academy. But instead of being angry, the director said that he thought that they would need more time to master this technique, but now he can safely admit that Lee Khan is much better than the Ironheads. Lee Khan, of course, was pleased to hear this, but he was almost sure that it would definitely not end just like that. But it looked like the director was in a good mood. And so the guy finally decided to ask him how to become better at control? The director told him that in fact this is a problem for many newbies, so there's really no need to worry. And Lee Khan was already thinking that it was all about magical energy. But fortunately, he was wrong. But then the director began to laugh, because this was another joke from him. Because in fact, everyone has problems with the spell, and it is possible to control it after a couple of attempts. Although, nevertheless, the Lich told him that he was the only one who launched the arrow, so he should try to figure out what was wrong himself, and then he was sure that the guy would increase his magic. Lee Kun bowed his head in front of him and thanked him for all this. And somehow the director was no longer having any fun mocking him, because he was behaving too much like an adult. Therefore, he decided to switch to the guy who was with them, because his reaction was much more interesting. But still, he decided to tell them that magic is such that the more you use it, the better you master it, so there is essentially nothing to be afraid of. And now he asked them to go to dinner. And just as Lee Kun wanted to say goodbye to the director and go to the dining room, he suddenly realized that his body was already there. He couldn't just believe his eyes. Could this really be teleportation? Lee Kun landed on the ground and immediately thought about the fact that the director didn't even lift a finger to transfer them here, but still used the magic of movement. Although he later noticed that Asen was not next to him, as it turned out later. He was sent to the infirmary to restore energy. But what was most offensive was that there was absolutely no one in the dining room, because dinner time had already passed. The food was the same as always, but the guy was glad that he still had smoked meat from last time. But as soon as he sat down at the table to start eating, the princess approached him quite unexpectedly, who apparently had been looking for him for quite a long time. He immediately stood up from his seat to ask her what she needed from him, after which she pulled out from behind her robe the list that the guy asked her to make. Li Han was surprised that she didn't forget about it, but in any case, he was incredibly grateful to her for it. But when he looked at this scroll, he realized that this was not a list of subjects that were easy to earn good grades in, but a list of popular subjects. Although this was not what he needed, he still read it to the end, and what surprised him most was the fact that alchemy remains one of the most popular activities. But still, he gathered his thoughts and told Her Majesty that apparently some mistake had occurred here, because he asked for a list of subjects in which it is easy to get good grades, and a list of popular subjects is fundamentally not what he needs. It was immediately clear from the girl's face that she didn't quite understand what the guy was telling her. Li Han had to explain that a popular subject has the peculiarity that it is attended by many skilled students, so it is difficult to get good grades. But with unpopular subjects, everything is exactly the opposite. The competition is lower, and getting good grades is therefore much easier. She couldn't believe that he was really just looking for things where it would be much easier. After all, he is the son of the Vardanaz house, and this is so unlike them, because they have always been hard-working. And looking at the desires of this guy, I just want to say something else. In that forest, it seemed to her that he was more consistent with the title of nobleman. But it seems she was simply mistaken. But in any case, she pulled out a list of items from her pocket that were best avoided. And this is exactly what the guy needed. And now he began to feel the smell of unpopularity that he so needed. The first subject on this list was the basics of fencing. In this subject, it is rare to see a person who made all the way to the School of Magic to study fencing. In fact, the same thing could be said with studying the basics of magical combat using the method of interval repetition, because students who came to school in search of the truth are not interested in fighting. But since these items are not so popular, the guy decided that he needed to study them as best as possible. So he was very grateful to Her Highness. She in turn was slightly disappointed in him and decided that it was time for her to leave. The next morning, Li Kun went to his new subject with the thought that everyone refused to go with him. Gainando didn't immediately understand why he should choose an unpopular subject, because at least people from high society don't do that. Yenna also did not support his idea, because as it turned out, she had already chosen the subjects she would take, and what Li Kun offered her was in no way included in her plans. Asen didn't understand at all why waste time on such nonsense, because there are so many more useful activities that they could do. Li Kun reacted to all this with a smile because he understood perfectly well that they had no idea what awaited them next. The guy knew that usually, regardless of the school, the teachers simply do not have the concept, because they know that the students have other subjects, but they sincerely do not care about it. Thus, in order to be able to concentrate on the subjects that students enjoy, he needs subjects where he can do nothing, so Li Han believed that this would be ideal for him. But he was still confused by one thing. He did not understand why classes on the basics of magical combat were held in the basement, although the stairs looked quite normal. But Li Kun was not completely left with a bad feeling. All residents of the Empire know that they should never thoughtlessly enter the Tower of Magicians, even if from the outside they look like ordinary people. But there were still stories when people got stuck in the tower forever after entering it once. Li Kun had been reading such tales since childhood, and understood perfectly well that they were actually exaggerated, and his master completely agreed with him. The man actually did not expect anything else from fairy tales, because people who enter the tower never leave it. But in reality, everything is much worse. They simply die there. Li Han was always not amused when he heard such words from his master, and since Einrogard is the embodiment of a magical tower, even the most curious first years rarely explore the tower. But Likan was sure that these were just fairy tales, because school remained school in the evening, so everything should be fine. In addition, he remembered that nothing happened to him on the first floor of the main building or in the dormitory, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the director, who wanted to ask the guy if he had accidentally gone to the first floor. Obviously, the guy was a little scared when he saw the director, because he didn't expect to meet him here. But then he seemed to be overwhelmed, and he thought that this was a great opportunity, and so he told the director that he was so glad to see him. After which he added that he was going to the first underground floor and would like to ask the director to share instructions with him. His instructions were quite expected, in fact. He told the guy that he would bring flowers to his coffin when they found his corpse. Lihan actually didn't expect anything different, but it was still worth trying to talk to him. A few minutes later, Lian was already on this first floor, and in fact, although he was scared, everything was quite normal here. But on the other hand, he still had the feeling that something sinister was hiding behind the door. Suddenly he noticed two students who, apparently just like him, had signed up for this subject. It even seemed to him that there were many students here, and he was not alone. This calmed him down a little. Suddenly the guys read the sign on the basis of magical combat, and realized that they had come to the wrong place, and they needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. They decided that they needed to leave as soon as possible, and along the way they began to discuss that it was unlikely that anyone had signed up for this subject at all, because people from all the towers were simply afraid to meddle here. And yet, when Likun entered the class, he saw three people who apparently weren't afraid and signed up for this subject, which couldn't help but make him happy. Some guys immediately looked at Likun and thought that he had wandered here completely by accident, although the guy heard all this and understood that he had come here on purpose. But then his attention focused on some strange ball. What is it for? Suddenly all his thoughts were interrupted after he heard a strange voice coming from the corner of the room, and most likely it was the teacher. Likun didn't even notice him, as did the other guys who were also in the class. As soon as the guy began to examine him more closely, he almost immediately noticed pale skin, a melancholic look, long fangs, and all this made him think that this man was a vampire. But guesses were quickly interrupted when this man introduced himself as Vagrek. He is a teacher of the basics of magical combat using the method of interval repetition, and with a rather downcast face, he hoped for fruitful cooperation. After which he decided to move on directly to the topic of the lesson, and began with the fact that on their desks there are balls made of heavenly spirit stone, which is very sensitive to magical energy. He also added that when the stars are in a certain position, they release holy energy and the star spirit stone is able to absorb it. After such a short theoretical course, he immediately invited them to move on to practice, and first of all told them to stand up and pour magical energy into the balls in front of them, although it seemed to Likun that this would not work. And he actually had such thoughts for a reason, because he couldn't even cope with simple spells. But still he overcame himself and tried. Before they had time to touch, suddenly all these balls flew into the air in an instant. Likun understood that he had done nothing for this. Most likely the teacher was to blame for this. But still he could not believe that he could do it so simply. Although later the thought came to him that most likely it was not just a star spirit stone, but an entire artifact. And judging by the initials on these stones, the professor made them himself, which is why he is so capable of manipulating them. The idea immediately arose in his head that well-made artifacts could be sold at a decent price, and this already interested him more than this item as a whole. One of the students went a little overboard with the energy she put into this ball, and it literally flew out of her control, and it seemed like it was going to break through the ceiling. But the professor assured them that the Shan is connected to their will, so they can control it. But he also placed a ban on destroying anything in the lecture hall. The girl noticed that this was an incredibly great idea, because any more and there would have been trouble. She thought too much and forgot about controlling this ball, so she deservedly hit her in the head with it. Vagrek informed them too late that this ban did not apply to them, so they must be extremely careful. Then he decided to continue the lesson and asked them to raise the ball into the air again, and every second Likun became more and more interesting in this lesson, and he liked the professor himself because he was unlike anyone else. Vagrek at one point asked them to make this ball start spinning around itself, and Likun had problems with this, because even when controlling such an artifact, he has some problems and does not move as the guy wants. One of the students managed to do this at one point, and the ball began to spin, but the professor remained just as cool-headed, and therefore asked him to do it again so that he could see it clearly. Lihan didn't really want to do this all day, so he decided to ask the professor how long they would do this. Vagrek did not understand why this question was asked at all, if the answer is obvious that they will do this until they manage to do it perfectly. After that, some of the guys suddenly wanted to go to the restroom, so they asked the professor about it, but he immediately made it clear to them that there was no need to ask him about it, because here they are free people and do whatever they want. In fact, the guys obviously just wanted to leave as soon as possible. because they simply did not understand what kind of object this was and why they should spin this ball all day long. Before the guys had time to leave, suddenly the only girl who was with them suddenly lost consciousness and fell from loss of strength. Li-han could notice the fact that she was incredibly persistent in her work, and he was pleased to watch people like her. But still, he understood perfectly well that he should help her come to her senses, because she most likely lost consciousness for a reason, but because she simply ran out of internal energy. The girl could barely speak, and then tried to say that she had simply run out of her mana and therefore she needed help. Li-kun actually understood this even without her, although it was surprising to him that she did not pretend to escape from this lesson. So he took her arm and told the professor that she had lost consciousness due to the fact that she had exhausted her supply mana. Vagrek did not change his face at all, and could only say that it would be nice for her to continue drawing the circle when she recovered. After Li-han helped the girl get to the first aid station, he returned to class and continued to practice. And he did this until he became interested in finding out how grades would be given in this lesson. So he decided to ask this question directly to the professor. For Vagrek, this was again a fairly obvious question, because grades will be given as required by the rules. The evaluation is carried out starting from the first place, regardless of how many students were present. Li-kun actually counted on this, because apparently no one else would take this class except him, and therefore this subject was just a jackpot for him. After all, it seemed to him that if he just held out until the end of the quarter, he could easily get the highest score for discipline. This is exactly the item that he was looking for. Now he just needs to repeat it, and he will do it with joy. It was quite interesting for Vagrek to observe that Li-kun still had not gone anywhere. The fact was that every year students come to this subject like the tide, but they also disappear like the ebb. Last year there was no one at all, but Vagrek didn't care about this at all, because according to the contract, he must teach the subject every year, and not collect those who want to attend it. In fact, every day he sat alone in the lecture hall and left when the class time was over. However, now it seemed to him that an unusual freshman had appeared and disrupted the usual routine, an adult and handsome man who, judging by his habits and speech, came from a great house. Vagrek did not know about the amount of magical energy Li-kun had, but he easily noticed that he was special. Vagrek also hoped that Li-kun would continue to attend classes, because then he would finally be able to move on to the second lesson of this subject. After this lesson, in the restroom, Li-kun asked to listen to his friends, and he said in all seriousness that this subject simply could not be missed, because they could be guaranteed to get good grades in it, simply for being present. But it was clear from their faces that he did not convince them at all, because they were not entirely interested in this, although Gainando asked Li-kun what exactly they teach. The guy happily talked about how he needed to use his mana to lift the Star Spirit Stone that the professor had prepared, and practice drawing a circle with it. Gainando wanted to hear what would happen next, but Li-kun replied with a smile that that was all, because they didn't do anything else, which surprised the guys a little. They didn't quite understand what was so important here, but Li-kun immediately interrupted them and said that the main thing here was that he would be able to get his grades, which he so needed. That's all he was interested in at the moment. Yena would never have thought that Li-han was such an unusual guy who would only think about himself. She actually understood very well that it was not for her to say such a thing, but in her opinion he was too much obsessed with profit. Li-kun wasn't too upset that they wouldn't go with him. Besides, it was time for him to run to the next subject. They were very curious to know what next subject he chose, and what was their surprise when he said that he would study the basics of fencing at the Academy of Magic. It seemed to them that this was an incredibly useless activity that could only be done at this academy. But Li-kun did not listen to them, and went to the courtyard at the southern entrance to the main building, where there was a training ground where fencing was taught. And his guesses turned out to be correct when he entered the main gate, and saw several guys there who apparently also came for this subject. Moreover, most of these guys were from the White Tiger Tower, which are mostly from the houses of knights, which means that they are good at swordsmanship and take it seriously. Therefore Li-han thought that the basics of magical combat were handed to him on a silver platter, so he was not so upset that there were so many people in fencing, and besides, he had been steadily practicing fencing. But he stood out too much for the other guys, who almost immediately saw that he was from the Blue Dragon Tower. Moreover, they recognized this guy because they knew that he was from the Vardana's house, and apparently he came here because his mentor taught him fencing for the sake of general development. But they all thought that he underestimated fencing too much. Li-han immediately realized that they weren't treating him very friendly here, and he also heard that they were all too proud of their skills here, but he still didn't expect that he would encounter such hostility. But on the other hand, he understood perfectly well that this is actually not so important after all. They are still just teenagers. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a huge troll, who rather unexpectedly came out of the gate. and he deliberately went to Li Kan in order to ask him if he was from Vardhanaz's house by chance. Li Kan did not quite understand why he was saying this, but still did not hide the fact that he was from this house and, moreover, lives in the Blue Dragon Tower. After which the orc began to say that it seemed to him that the guy was in the wrong place, because they were seriously engaged in fencing here and not teaching beginners. Li Kan calmly thanked him for the information, but this angered the orc even more, who thought that the guy simply did not understand him, and therefore once again repeated to him that they were not just waving swords here, as aristocrats do. Then he added that he could be seriously injured in sparring, and no one here would give in to him just because he was a nobleman. Li Hun waved his hand in response to this, and said that he would try to restrain himself in the battle with the orc so as not to injure him. These words quite obviously hooked the orc, and so he began to boil like a kettle. And if the professor had not come out at that moment, then most likely he would have gotten into a fight, but the teacher called them to come to him in time. One could see surprise on Li Kan's face, because he did not expect to see such a picture. The fact was that the fencing teacher was Professor Ingerdell, and what surprised the guy was that he was an elf. After which the elf added that he was sure that they had all already learned fencing here, and most likely came here to improve their skills, or not to lose the ones they had already developed. Therefore, he suggested that they immediately move on to practicing existing skills, instead of learning from the very basics. And this was good news for Li Han, because he was really only interested in his grades from the very beginning. Suddenly all his thoughts were interrupted by some small elf from the White Tiger Tower, who came up, it seemed, just to say hello. Looking at this elf, Li Kan immediately thought that he looked like an elf who was popular with girls, but his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the same guy who asked Li Kan, "Or is he from the house of Vardhanaz?" After Li Han's answer, this elf added that he was actually just curious to know why someone from the famous house of magicians came to learn how to wield a sword. But for Li Kan it was again very obvious, because he believed that few people would choose this activity, so it would be easier for him to earn good grades. Although in his mind, Li Han thought that if he told the truth, then this guy would hardly understand him correctly, so he decided that it would be easier for both of them if he pretended that he only cared about grades. This elf, as it turned out, is called Giselle, and he is from the house of Murad, but he asked Li Kan to call him Murad. Li Kan immediately turned his attention to his hands, which were calloused, although it was worth noting that outwardly he looked like a sissy, but of course he didn't tell him that, but simply replied that he was pleased to meet you. Although on the other hand, Li Kan understood that there was nothing more to expect from his house, so he simply shook his hand. The Murads strictly adhere to the rules and protect the north, being in harsh conditions. They are literally ready to resort to any means, methods, and tricks to achieve their goals. At least that's what Li Han thought until he met Murad, who is completely different from them. But he remembered how people reacted to him and realized that rumors are actually not always true, so you shouldn't listen to them blindly. The art of the sword is a blue stone. It was taught to Li Kan by Arlog, and based on the name, one can guess that it is effective and easy to use. But the training was so difficult that the nobles did not really take up them. But Li Kan still managed to master them, because he believed that if you convince yourself that you can handle it, then it will be so. When suddenly the master interrupted his thoughts, because he became interested in knowing whether Li Kan uses the art of the blue stone. The professor immediately noticed that he had a well-developed background, and therefore began to think that most likely the guy was from some house where fencing was valued. But his face immediately changed to surprise after he heard that the guy was from Vardhanaz's house. The master simply could not believe it, because the guy was able to master the basics, even being in a house where magic is more valued. Therefore, he first decided to clarify with the guy himself why he decided to study fencing, to which he received an answer from Li Kan that he was convinced that this was a vital skill for an aristocrat. But it was impossible to say from the master's face that he believed him. But in any case, Li Kan understood that the most important thing now is grades, and if he says something wrong now, then most likely he can say goodbye to good grades. Li Kan decided to say something that would raise him in the eyes of the teacher, so he said that he thought so before. But as he progressed in his study, he realized that he could not help but come here. From the expression on the master's face, it immediately became clear that he liked this answer quite a lot, because he changed his face and showed a characteristic hand gesture. But then the professor still asked the guy for forgiveness, and added that he actually accidentally voiced what he was thinking. Looking at Li Han, he now understood that with his background in magic, he would make a serious swordsman, because he takes fencing more seriously than the students from the Tiger Tower. Therefore, the man could not help but say that thanks to Li Kan, he understood something, and that was that he would also be as serious as possible with him. After which, he asked the guy to immediately take out his wooden sword, and they would begin the lesson immediately. But Li Kan did not expect this, and it seemed to him that this should not be the case. After some time, Li Kan was completely beaten and lying on the ground. Apparently they took him too seriously. The master, who was probably his opponent, stood over him and told the guy that the art of bluestone is like a boulder. And he thought so because his strong point is that he will not waver no matter what happens. The master only asked him not to forget about it. But for today, he suggested finishing the lesson, and from Lee Khan's state, it was clear that he didn't mind. For Lee Khan, today the lesson was completed, and he could go to rest. Although in his mind he was thinking about how much his body hurt, it seemed to him that he had been hit more than 1,000 times in every point of his body. It was only worth noting how the master took advantage of his weak points and gaps in defense, which is probably why Lee Khan was there until the end of the battle. Although Lee Khan realized that the professor was taking him too seriously, because in the future it would be the White Tiger guys who would become real knights, but he treated them much easier than he treated Lee Khan. If Arlog is like an unshakable stone, then Ingerdel is like a stream of water despite his prosthetic arms and legs. And while Lena was thinking about this, Ingerdel was telling his subordinates that if they use the cloud art, then they need to alternate hands more, because the difficulty of two swords is that they are difficult to master. So he asked them to be more thoughtful when they use them. What about the art of the top of the moon? He could say that it is a fast and sharp art in which one must use the body to strike. Lehan really enjoyed watching how this professor treated each student, because not only does he know absolutely every martial art, but he also gives each student personal advice. But even in this case, Lee Khan could not understand why he could not leave the feeling that he had been beaten more than anyone, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Ingerdel, who rather unexpectedly asked Lee Khan to come to him. The guy was worried that the teacher called him to him, but he was not the only one who was called by the elf, because the second person was Durju from Choi's house. And this second person was precisely the ogre with whom Lee Khan did not get along from the very beginning. But the most interesting thing was ahead, because as soon as they approached the teacher, he told them that they would now have a duel. The other guys didn't understand why they were the ones, and in general it seemed to them that this fight would not be entirely fair. But Durgu liked this idea incredibly much, so he did not argue with the professor. The master liked that none of them resisted, so he gave each of them a wooden sword with which they would fight. Lee Khan at that moment understood perfectly well that his enemy was most likely waiting for this moment most of all. But now the guy has no intention of retreating. Moreover, as a child he could have spent his time playing, but instead he learned to fence and got bruises, but never gave up. And he did all this just for moments like these, to stand on equal terms in a fencing duel. Ingerdel actually chose them because they seemed to him the most capable. Every experienced knight knew that it was impossible to master the art of the sword through theory alone. Only by practicing hundreds of times and conducting real battles can one see the path of the sword. For example, if a knight has learned to reach his opponent's neck, but he doesn't know how to do anything else, then it will not be so easy to reach his opponent. Knights use theory only as a basis, and understanding and applied skills as a supporting factor to extract the absolute power of sword art. And according to the professor, these two are not only able to reach this stage, but also put faint traces of magic into the swords, which means that they are especially gifted as knights. Therefore today they will be able to prove it, and the master asked them to take their places and begin the duel. Looking at Lehan, the teacher thought that he had a good level of swordsmanship, no matter what house he came from. In addition, he was almost sure that the guy had experienced enormous pressure from his home since childhood, but he was very serious about this. Therefore, it seemed to him that Lee Khan was a very capable student, whom he would lead along the path of the sword, no matter what the cost, and then gave the order to start the battle. In fact, he is expecting a lot from this fight, because he thinks that they are both pretty good with a sword, so the fight should be quite interesting. Choi House's Moontop art is fast and furious, as opposed to Lehan's who uses Bluestone art, which is strong and thorough. Ingerdel thought that since they were absolute opposites, they would have something to learn from each other. He believed that this was what opponents were for. The orc decided that since Lee Khan was standing and not attacking, he would do it first. The guy barely managed to dodge this blow, which flew incredibly close to his face. In response to this, Lee Khan decided to act a little dishonestly and threw sand at the orc, which blinded him for a while. Other students tried to tell the professor that this was dishonest, but the man was shocked by such an act. In his opinion, Lee Khan was using everything he could, and that was right. Because in his head, first of all, it was a fight for life, and it didn't matter how to defeat the enemy. And in his opinion, Lee Khan understands the meaning of these words with precision, so he has nothing to say to him. But Ingerdel also understood other students who saw this as foul play, and therefore believed that they simply needed more time to understand this. And all because they were born in houses where honor is respected, so perhaps they will never be able to learn such things. Moreover, he is able to ignore the words of other people in order to win. This is why the teacher likes Lee Khan, because only a true swordsman does this. The orc at that moment only thought that Lee Khan had acted incredibly low, but on the other hand it helped him weaken his defense. Lee Khan, at this time, was not going to stop there and continued to attack. because he was sure that the orc still could not think clearly and would most likely miss the blow again. Therefore, without thinking for a long time, he continued to advance, and it could not be said that his actions were unsuccessful. Lee Khan actually didn't waste any time while he sat and rested from the battle. He carefully watched his opponent, and when he saw his movements, he immediately realized that the orc was a pretty capable guy who should not be underestimated. But this still won't help him. At least that's what Lee Khan himself thought, who did everything to create a scenario thanks to which he could win this battle. At some point, this began to bother Durgu, and since his opponent had gone so far, he decided to answer him in kind. Therefore, he decided to pretend that Lee Khan hit him incredibly hard with his sword, and because of this, he was injured. The guy didn't understand how it happened at all. It seemed to him that he didn't hit the orc at all, so why did he suddenly end up on the ground? Durgu lay and thought only that there was no need to think about how he looked now. The main thing was to win this battle. The teacher liked all this incredibly much, so he clapped his hands until his students behind him did not understand at all what was happening. This turned out to be too humiliating for Durgu, so he decided that he would do everything to take revenge on Lee Khan. So he went on the attack again. He dealt blow after blow, but the guy skillfully dodged all the blows he saw. The fight was really interesting, even better than Ingerdell expected, because the guys are really very capable. Although he still did not expect that Durgu would demonstrate mastery of the art of the top of the moon at such a high level. But on the other hand, the teacher perfectly understood that the stronger and faster the blows, the more he spends stamina. But does Durgu understand this? Looking at Lee Khan, one could only say that he, on the contrary, remains calm and only responds to the enemy's attacks. And the guy was focused on the fight for a reason, because he understood that his opponent's blows were quite strong, and missing even one would be critical for him. But even this was not the biggest problem for him, because he simply did not understand what kind of pressure that was coming from Durgu. Chaos was happening in him until he forced himself to collect his thoughts and not concentrate, because he understood perfectly well that he should not show his emotions, because he could still take advantage of the opportunity and win. In addition, it was noticeable how the orc was bad at making decisions, since he did not expect such a turn of events, and this led to the fact that he made too many unnecessary movements, which in his opinion should have helped him. Moreover, judging by the mana in his sword, it is obvious that he is approaching the limit of his physical abilities. Lee Khan in turn does not get tired at all using a small amount of mana. Therefore, in his opinion, the guy's victory is only a matter of time. But by this point, you still need to hold out, because blocking every attack of this guy is not so easy. Durgu at that moment simply could not understand what was happening and why he could not defeat this guy. Was he really not putting in enough strength? And looking at Lee Khan, he didn't understand at all why the guy didn't get tired, and it felt like he just didn't show his emotions. It seemed to the orc that all his actions were as if he was trying to split a mountain with a needle, and all his actions only led to the fact that it all benefits only Lee Khan. Although at one point, Lee Khan still managed to make several good counterattacks, the result of which was that he literally knocked the sword out of the orc's hands, after which it didn't take him much time to put the sword in front of the orc's face and end this fight. At the same moment, Ingerdell appeared, who was happy to announce that the duel was officially over. Ingerdell at that moment thought that Durgu needed to be a little calmer, and everything could have been completely different, but he collapsed under the weight of the pressure of his opponent. Given his young age, this must have been difficult to bear, because mentally he wanted to win incredibly badly. Lycan at this moment radiates the energy characteristic of a high-ranking aristocrat, but the master could not help but tell them that they both had a truly excellent fight, and he also believed that the victory was not 100%. And he says all this only so that the winner remains humble, and the loser does not stop persisting for the sake of his further growth. And now, in his opinion, the most important moment has come, when they should shake hands and disperse peacefully. Lee Khan, looking into the eyes of his opponent, understood perfectly well that judging by his character, he would not remain silent, and if he did something wrong, the guy was immediately ready to answer him. But Durgu decided not to do that. On the contrary, he extended his hand and said that it was a good fight, and he also did not forget to ask for forgiveness for being rude to him then. After which he added that Lee Khan is actually more than competent to attend these classes, which the guy simply did not expect. Although there was a thought in his head that the ogre could thus dull his attention in order to attack, but apparently this is not the case. Therefore, in response, he also decided to shake his hand and say that Durgu was probably just worried at that moment, so he said too much. In the evening after this lesson, Durgu was returning to his room when suddenly he was surrounded by students who most likely wanted to talk to him about something. But these were only pawns of the one who actually wanted to talk to him. The same elf who approached Lacan wanted to ask the ogre if he planned to leave everything as it was after such humiliation. Degru did not understand what this conversation was all about, because he lost, because he simply did not have enough abilities. But everyone around him began to prove to him that Lacan simply threw sand at him and generally fought dishonestly, which is why he lost. But in fact, he was not at all to blame. The elf who stood behind everyone suddenly began to say that in fact, in this situation, something completely different is important, namely that the honor and pride of their tower was trampled on because of him, and therefore he believed that Dugru should suffer his well-deserved punishment for this. The ogre understood perfectly well that the Murad house ruled everything among the knightly houses, so this situation bothered him a little. Murad added that the punishment would actually be simple. The little elf believed that if Durjiu could not defeat him personally, then he would need to do it with numbers. It seemed to the ogre that the knights should be ashamed to even think about this, let alone act like this. Murad believed that he was wrong and only losers said such stupidity. Some guys who were also there did not understand why they were doing this because it seemed to them that it was too much. Murad was annoyed by the fact that they were all talking behind his back, so he invited everyone who was not happy with something to tell him about it personally. But in response to these words, all they did was fall silent. Only Dugri found the